Okay, so with that said, since we've talked adaptation, we'll jump ahead. This is kind of our last introductory slide. We've really already kind of talked about all this stuff previously back in the earlier part of the lecture when we talked about labeled lines. A sensory pathway is a group of parallel chains of neurons conveying sensory information from sensory receptors in the periphery to the cerebral cortex. Each chain of the sensory pathways is a labeled line conveying sensory information about one particular modality. So in other words, this receptor, this receptor, this receptor, they're all activated by a different stimulus. Maybe this is sensitive to cold, maybe this one's sensitive to pressure, whatever. Okay, but this labeled line, those middle lines that you see there, only would be sending in the sense for scent or cold or pressure or whatever. Okay, the neurons are named based on which order they are in the pathway. The first order neurons are the ones attached or associated with those receptors that you see there. They convey information into the central nervous system from sensory receptors in our body. They are the ones that then travel up the spinal cord and can synapse with second order neurons, like we show here occurring in the brainstem. We see here in purple a new shaded color instead of blue to denote the second order neurons, which are usually located either in the brainstem or the spinal cord. Okay, most of them ascend to the thalamus, which, as we know, hopefully you guys remember this for the exam, is the gateway to the cerebral cortex, because that's where the signaling is transmitted to the neurons that therefore carry it, or the signal that is, to the cerebral cortex. Now, right here, it's not labeled, but we actually see taking place in the brainstem with those second order neurons is that process of decussation, which is taking place in the medulla oblongata, specifically the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, which is where the signals cross over from one side of the medulla to the other. Okay. So the third order neurons are stimulated by those second order neurons. The third order neurons project to fourth order neurons, if there are, and they don't show those in this illustration, but fourth order neurons extend to different areas in the cerebral cortex for perception. Fourth order neurons can extend to higher order neurons and association areas in the cerebral cortex where complex integration of sensory information takes place. Different sensory pathways extend to and activate different areas of the cerebral cortex. Although most sensory pathways are organized in a manner just described, sensory pathways can vary with respect to the number of neurons in the chains or in their chains and the parts of the brain or spinal cord where they form synapses. So this is just kind of a illustration that shows a pretty typical order, but not maybe the order for every single sensation. All right, and at this point, what we're going to do is start talking about the different sensations that we have occurring to us and the types that we experience. Remember, thinking back to the beginning of the lecture, we learned that there are two major types of senses, the general senses and the special senses. Okay, there's 5 special senses. We'll get into those here in just a little bit. Okay. There's 2 types of general senses, visceral, associated with internal conditions, viscera or internal organs. So I mentioned we wouldn't really get into those in this class. It's just pretty complicated stuff. The other type, what we see here are somatic senses. Somatic sensations arise from stimulating sensory receptors in places like our skin, where we have a lot of them. The subcutaneous layer, which is just deep to the skin, our skeletal muscles, our tendons, and our joints. Okay, we talked about this last week, but the sensory receptors for our somatic sensations are distributed unevenly. In other words, some parts of the body surface are more densely populated with receptors and only contain, and others only contain a few. The places that are the most sensitive have the highest density of somatic sensory receptors, and those are places like the tip of our tongue, the lips, the fingertips. Talked about how you can do like a 2-point discrimination test on like your fingers versus on the back of your leg or something like that. 4 modalities of somatic sensations are tactile, thermal, pain, proprioceptive. Okay, tactile sensations include touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. Receptors involved with these, and I'm not going to get into really any specifics more than what's listed here. Include mysomer corpuscles, which are in the dermal papillae of our hairless skin. Hair root plexuses, which wrap around our hair follicles, enable our hair to basically be an extension of our sensory system. Merkel discs, which are in the deepest layers of the epidermis, Ruffini corpuscles in the deep dermis, and Pacini or lamellae corpuscles in many places of the body. Thermal sensations involve thermoreceptors, and there's two types of thermal sensations, coldness and warmth, detected by different receptors. Cold receptors are located in the epidermis, respond to coldness. Warm receptors are going to respond to warmth. Now, those two receptors have a kind of a point where they can be stimulated, but maybe it's not a point. Let me describe it as a range. Okay. Let me phrase the question, or let me phrase it like this. If you are experiencing something super cold or super hot, instead of feeling cold or warm, what's the sensation that you're going to experience? Just something super hot. What do you feel? Not hot, but pain. Okay. So pain, which is one of those somatic sensations, becomes stimulated in that situation. We'll discuss those in the next few slides. Okay. We'll also get a little bit more into proprioceptive sensations, which are going to allow us to know where our head, our limbs are located, how they're moving if we're not looking at them. So we can walk, type, dress without even using our eyes. You know, you can all close your eyes and touch your nose. Okay. You can like close your eyes and you can still feel like if your elbows are in a straight position or a bent position, you can feel how your body's oriented. That's what proprioceptive sensations allow for. Okay, kinesthesia is the perception of our body movements. The receptors involved with proprioceptive sensations are called proprioceptors. Pretty straightforward as to why they get that name. That includes muscle spindles. Those are the ones that we've talked about last week that are responsible for that stretch reflex, like when you tap on the patellar tendon. Okay, we also talked about the tendon reflex. That's what tendon organs or Golgi tendon organs are responsible for. And then joint kinesthetic receptors are found within structures of the joint. And we'll talk a little bit more about those here. First, let's talk a little bit more about pain though. Pain can be described as a discomfort, and that's a pretty loose description of what pain is, but it's caused by tissue injury or noxious stimulation mediated by specialized nerve endings called nociceptors. Once again, I always ask the question, do you want to stimulate them? Most people would answer no. So that's an easy way to remember. Nociceptors are the pain sensitive receptors. Find them in all tissues except in the body except for our brain. So when you have like a headache, it's not your brain that's aching. Okay. When tissues are injured, okay, they release several chemicals that stimulate these nociceptors, and that results in the trigger of the sensation of pain. Most common and most potent pain stimulus is a chemical called bradykinin. Okay. Now, when we are experiencing pain, we have specific ascending spinal tracts that are used to transmit this pain from our periphery up into our brain. And there's kind of two major pain projection pathways, the spinothalamic tract and the spinoreticulator tract. You kind of just break down their names, it's going to tell you exactly what's going on. In the spinothalamic tract, which I would highlight this as the most significant pain pathway, this involves a signal traveling up the spinal cord into the thalamus. Okay, and so the second order neurons are the ones that carry the signal up to the thalamus, where they then synapse with the third order neurons that carry the signal up into our various regions of the cerebral cortex. And that's where we're able to feel the pain. We're able to have that perception, be aware, ouch, I've pricked my finger. Okay. The spinoreticulator tract carries signals to the reticular formation. Remember, the reticular formation is a cluster of gray matter, is kind of gray matter and like the spinal cord up in the brain stem, a little bit up into maybe even the cerebellum and the diencephalon. Okay, as you can see, signals that travel to the reticular formation of our brain stem eventually relay signals to our hypothalamus and limbic systems. which trigger visceral, emotional, and behavioral reactions. Okay. Remember, the hypothalamus is a major regulator of our autonomic nervous system, right? Controlling our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and glands. Okay. Not only when we experience pain do we feel that pain, but changes happen to our visceral organs. You know, for example, our heart rate is going to change. Our blood pressure is going to change. Okay. What's the nickname for the limbic system? Your emotional brain. Okay. Think about what pain can do to emotions. Okay. And what type of emotions can result from pain. Okay. So that's why, you know, pain can trigger not only, you know, that sensation of pain, but we can also experience changes to organs, emotions, and our behaviors. Maybe we say cuss words like what happened when I smashed my finger a few weeks ago. Now, there are several types of pain. So I'll let you guys fill in the blanks here if there are any. Okay, there's not. So I'll just go and talk. First type of pain is fast pain. It is a feeling of sharp, localized stabbing pain perceived at the time of injury. When I say that it's localized, I mean we're feeling it right exactly where that painful stimulus is at. In the case of like pricking your finger, that pain is very localized to that very specific. It's not like the entire finger hurts, not like the whole hand hurts. It's very specific to that little area that was damaged. Okay. In the case of fast pain, it's going to travel by way of myelinated pain fibers, transmitting signals at 12 to 30 meters per second. So that's an incredible amount of speed. And therefore, the signal gets to our brain from our periphery very, very fast. Okay. We can also describe this pain as being acute, sharp, or pricking pain. Okay. Think about like when you stub your toe, and that's something we've all probably done. You feel that pain right there on the tip of your toe, but then a minute or two goes by and that pain starts to kind of dissipate. And what you might feel is more of a throbbing, aching pain. Okay, that's what slow pain is. Slow pain is longer lasting. It's more dull and diffused. So in other words, it's not as sharp and it's more spread out. That's what diffuse means. Okay. This type of pain travels much slower. It's going to do so by unmyelinated pain fibers, which carry the signal at 0.5 to 2 meters per second. Okay. We can describe this pain as being chronic, burning, aching, or throbbing. We've all experienced that. You know, I just mentioned like I smashed my finger. It hurt immediately. That was the fast pain. And then a few minutes go by, and then you know you can feel that throbbing sensation. That's slow pain. Okay, so that's how we can describe pain based on its signaling speed. In the case of the last three categories here, this is pain described based on its location, where it's coming from. In other words, superficial somatic pain is pain originating from the skin. Superficial means towards the outside of the body, right? Well, what's the most outer part of our body? Our skin. Okay, so when you scrape your knee, you're feeling superficial somatic pain. Okay, whereas deep somatic pain is pain originating skeletal muscles, joints, tendons, or fascia, which deep is the opposite of superficial, means more inside. Okay, so if you have sore muscles, you're experiencing deep somatic pain. Okay, if you have a sunburn, you're feeling superficial somatic pain. Okay, visceral pain is pain from our viscera, which would be our internal organs. So pain in those various internal organs, whether that's, you know, like stomach pain or God forbid, heart pain and that kind of stuff, which, you know, could be very, very bad, obviously. All right, I've kind of already explained the first bullet, but fast pain, very precisely localized to the stimulated area. For example, if someone pricks you with a pin, you know exactly which part of your body was stimulated. Somatic slow pain is also as well localized, but more diffuse, and it involves larger areas. So you feel it in not just that very, very specific area, but kind of more spread out. In instances of visceral pain, pain in our internal organs, instead of feeling the pain in that internal organ, you're going to feel the pain somewhere else. Okay, enter just deep to the skin that overlies that stimulated organ. And this phenomenon is called referred pain. You guys ever heard of referred pain before? Hey, I bet you've learned about something else that involves referred pain that I'm going to explain here in just a second. But referred pain occurs when our brain assumes visceral pain is actually coming from the skin. So in other words, it's an organ that's hurting, but your brain interprets it as the skin is hurting. Okay. And this is due to the visceral organs being involved in the area to which the pain is referred, being served by the same segment on the spinal cord. So 2 examples illustrated here show signals coming in by way of first order neurons, one coming from the skin, one coming from the heart, into the back of the spinal cord, where a synapse occurs with a second order neuron. And that second order neuron is going to transmit the signal up to the brain. Doesn't matter if that signal came from this neuron or this neuron, the signal is going to go up to the brain. Okay. Well, in this case, what's going to happen is the signal is going to go up to the brain, and the brain's going to assume the pain's coming from the skin because that's where pain typically comes from. That's where we experience majority of our pain, because that's the part that, we're exposed to the outside world, we get hurt in those, right? Okay. Well, when our heart, for example, is actually hurting, the brain is probably just going to assume it's coming from the skin and doesn't actually know it. Okay. And this is common in people that are experiencing what's called a myocardial infarction, which most people would describe as what? A heart attack. Okay. And so one of the most common symptoms a person is experiencing when having a heart attack, aside from the chest pain where the heart's actually hurting, but it's also pain that's radiating down their left arm. Okay. And this is the reason why. And this is a mapping showing you locations of referred pain, which can be kind of wild. Some people experience a little bit of pain up in their jaw when they're having a heart attack. If their liver or gallbladder is having an issue, they might feel pain up in their right upper shoulder and their upper back. And some places you can feel pain down in the legs. Pretty far away in some cases are these areas of the skin compared to the organ that's actually under duress. And that's what can be tricky. Thankfully, doctors have a pretty good idea. And, especially, emergency room doctors.
If your shoulder is hurting, it could be a symptom of your gallbladder.
Mm-hmm.
Why? How? It's nowhere near it.
Because of this, the signaling traveling up to the brain. Basically, kind of like crossed wires, and the brain just doesn't know exactly which wire it originated from. Pretty well. All right. The other somatic sense that we're going to talk a little bit more about, we're not going to really get into tactile or thermal, is proprioceptive or proprioception. Proprioceptive sensations or proprioception allow us to know where our head, our limbs are located, how they're moving, even if we're not even looking at them. Allows you to walk tight dress without using your eyes, something that a lot of people just really take for granted. How amazing we can do these body movements. Kinesthesia, as I mentioned earlier, is perception of body movements. The receptors involved, and I've already mentioned this, are proprioceptors, which are embedded in muscles, especially our postural ones and in our tendons, providing us with degrees to which muscles are contracted, the amount of tension that a tendon is experiencing, and the position of our joints. Like I said, this is what can enable you to close your eyes and touch your nose. Allows you to close your eyes and still be able to feel if your knees bent, your arms bent, where those limbs are located, even if you're not looking at them. One of the coolest things that our proprioceptors allows for us is to perform what we call weight discrimination. The ability to assess the weight of an object, especially helpful when determining the muscular effort necessary to perform a task. Thinking about lifting objects up, my dad's getting ready to move, and we've been moving boxes and stuff like that. If you've ever experienced a time where you go to lift something that's super light but looks super big, your whole body, you put a lot of work into it, put a lot of effort in. It's almost like you put so much in that you lose balance. Sometimes you almost fall over. Or you go to lift something and it's super heavy and it looks super light, and you find out the hard way, it feels like your arm about falls off. Weight discrimination enables us to just do what we need to do to lift something up. We don't require all 100% muscular effort when we lift something light. That would be really worthless if we were lifting something as hard as we could every time we lifted something. We get tired real quick. There are three very important slowly adapting proprioceptors found in one's joints: muscle spindles, tendon organs, and joint kinesthetic receptors. Muscle spindles are actually visible here in the picture. This is a view of, looks like the bicep brachial muscle, not that that really matters. But muscle spindles, proprioceptors that monitor changes in the length of a skeletal muscle, and they are the ones, I've already mentioned this today, but participate in that stretch reflex, like when you tap on the tendon and the muscle contracts as a result. Okay, what muscle spindles are the fibers that wrap around our muscle fibers. So muscle fibers are our muscle cells. So these neurons wrap around our muscle fibers and they monitor the length of that muscle. Okay, by adjusting how vigorously a muscle spindle responds to stretching of a skeletal muscle, our brain can set an overall level of muscle tone, which we've previously learned is a small degree of contraction present even when a muscle is at rest. Tendon organs, which also go by the term Golgi tendon organs, located at the junction of a tendon and a muscle. They're involved with the tendon reflexes, act to protect tendons and their associated muscles from damage due to excessive tension. What's not pictured here would be what we call joint kinesthetic receptors, which are found around the articular capsules, which is the connective tissue of our synovial joints. And synovial joints, most of you guys are in anatomy know, those are like the major joints, like our shoulder, our elbow, our hip, our knee. But they respond to things like pressure, acceleration, deceleration of the joints during movements, and help adjust muscles when excessive strain is placed on the joints. Okay. All three of these can be described as slowly adapting. Remember, that refers to whether they continue sending signals or not. Adaptation was the very last thing that we talked about last time. These guys don't like get used to a sensation. They continually provide information. And that way, we're continually providing information about our muscles and tendons and joints. Now, those various somatic sensations and pathways involved relay information from our somatic sensory receptors just described to the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex and to your cerebellum. The pathways to the cerebral cortex consist of thousands of sets of three specific neurons. The first order neurons, which are the ones associated with the receptors, carry the signal into the brainstem or spinal cord, where they are either going to be traveling by cranial nerves into the brain or spinal nerves into the spinal cord. They synapse with second order neurons, conducting the impulses from the brainstem and spinal cord to the thalamus. These are the ones that decussate or cross over in our brainstem, like we saw this basically same image a couple of slides ago. And then from the thalamus, our gateway to the cerebral cortex, the signal goes up to the somatosensory area of our cerebral cortex. If you remember, somatosensory area was one of those functional areas of the cerebral cortex, not the primary visual area, not the primary auditory area, but specifically the primary somatosensory area. Okay. The three general pathways that carry these somatic sensory impulses are what we call the posterior medial lemniscus pathway, interlateral pathways, and trigeminal thalamic pathway. Not that you really need to know that. Here is an illustration of that primary somatosensory area or cortex mapped out, describing what's called the homunculus. Anybody ever heard that word before? Okay. This illustration is showing you what we'll call the sensory homunculus. Okay. And basically it's a mapping of that primary somatosensory area and showing you which segment of that area is dedicated to which part of the body. For example, you can see the face and especially the lips and the hands occupy a very big region of the cerebral cortex. And that demonstrates that those areas are going to be loaded with the most receptors and are therefore the most sensitive. Okay? Not only are there more receptors than in places like our hands and our lips, but a bigger area of the cerebral cortex is dedicated to processing those signals. Okay? The primary somatosensory area we learned previously is found in the postventral gyrus of our parietal lobes. Gyri is plural since there's two of these. Okay, but they receive sensory input from the different parts of the body. Okay, if you ever wondered, sometimes students have heard that word before, homunculus. You can actually buy little dolls that are a representation of the sensory homunculus, and they look super creepy. I show this every semester, and students typically get weirded out. I had one student a couple years ago that was like, "Oh man, I'm going to buy that," for whatever reason. I don't know, but to each their own. That's the homunculus, somatic sensory pathways. Okay, and with that said, we're done with the somatic senses. We're ready to talk about the 5 special senses. Okay, we'll start with smell, which probably is one of the 2 simplest. Okay, with that said, none of these 5 are simple. They're all fairly complex. I shouldn't even say fairly, I should say very complex. Fancy word for smell is olfaction. Like all special senses, has a low threshold. In other words, it's really easy to stimulate the sense of smell. Only a few molecules of certain substances need to be present in air to be perceived as an odor. We all know that our nose is where we process or where we smell things, but it's not where we process it. That's our brain. The sensory organs associated with the sense of smell are found within an area in the upper part of our nasal cavity called the olfactory epithelium. Okay, the olfactory epithelium is shaded here in the next page in purple. It's located just below the roof of our nasal cavity, what's called the cribriform plate, alongside what we call the superior nasal conchae. Okay. Inside of the olfactory epithelium are these different types of cells and glands, the most important of which are the olfactory receptors. Okay. Olfactory receptor cells are bipolar neurons. That means they are rare. Remember, bipolar neurons have the cell body on the inside between the 2 extensions. They're extremely sensitive, so it's easy to stimulate them. They're also easily fatigued. In other words, they adapt really quickly. That's why sensation, smell, we smell something pretty quickly, but then even if that smell persists, we might not continue to smell it. Okay. These are the direct first order neurons of the olfactory pathway. Now, on the dendrites of these guys are structures called olfactory hairs. There's cilium. Okay. They touch the olfactory epithelium that lines the upper surface of the nasal cavity. And these are the actual receptors that are stimulated by odorants. Odorants just being the things that we smell. Okay. Like I said, they're just basically tiny little extensions coming off of the receptors. Okay. We look at this figure on the next page, we can kind of see the different cells here in the olfactory epithelium. I guess the purple shaded color is the cells that I just mentioned, the receptor cells, the bipolar neuron. Here's one extension, here's the other, so that's why they're bipolar. And then you can kind of see very faintly here these little thin, tiny squiggly lines. Those are the hairs. Those are the cilia, whatever you want to call them. And these little red dots here are the things that are being smelled. Okay. Supporting cells literally tell you exactly what they do. They're going to provide support, nourishment, and electrical insulation for the olfactory receptor cells. They also help detoxify chemicals that they come in contact with. And from what I've researched and what research has been done, I believe these cells that are the cause for people losing their smell from COVID. Okay. When that virus infects the body, it binds to specific receptors on cells throughout the body. Okay. It would make sense that the receptors, the ones that actually carry the impulse into the brain, would be the ones that are targeted that cause us to lose the sense of smell. But it's actually these supporting cells. Okay. The supporting cells are the ones that actually have the receptor, and then the virus infects it. And that's where the loss of smell comes from. At least that's what research is showing anyway. Basal cells also just go by stem cells, replace those olfactory receptors by mitosis. So these guys can end up becoming these guys. Now, very important to help with the sense of smell, not directly going to be acting as a facilitator of smelling, are these glands that produce our mucus. Olfactory or Bowman's glands produce mucus carried to the surface of the epithelium by ducts. What's important about this mucus is it helps moisten the epithelial surface, but more importantly for the sense of smell, it dissolves the odorants. Okay, and so that way those odorants can bind to the receptors, and that's what triggers those olfactory receptor cells. Okay. Now, on each side of our nose, about 40 bundles of the slender unmyelinated axons of these olfactory receptor cells extend through about 20 foraminal holes in the cribriform plate of our ethmoid bone. That's what this illustration is showing you. Okay. Basically, we're zooming in on this little box here in our picture. This structure here, kind of in the whitish, brownish, tan shade, is the roof of our nasal cavity, what's called the cribriform plate. Okay. If you zoom in at it, you see that there are little holes. These little holes are called olfactory foramina, and this enables the axons of these receptor cells to penetrate out of the nose and into a structure called the olfactory bulbs. The olfactory bulbs are the beginning of your first olfactory cranial nerves, your cranial nerves number 1 that we previously learned about in our last lecture. Okay. Those 40 or so bundles of axons collectively form the right and left olfactory cranial nerves number 1. Okay. They terminate in the brain in pairs massive with gray matter called olfactory bulbs located just below the frontal lobes of our cerebrum. Now, inside the olfactory bulbs, the axon terminals of these olfactory receptor cells synapse with other cells, with olfactory bulb neurons. That would be like these mitral cells, the glomeruli. Okay. From there, those olfactory bulb neurons extend posteriorly, so towards the back of the body, and they form what we call the olfactory tract. Okay. Now, from there, the signal is going to travel to 2 places in our brain. Okay. Some of the axons project to the primary olfactory area, which is in our temporal lobes. Okay. This allows for conscious awareness of smells. That's what it's going to let you to know, hey, that smells great. Okay. Like when I walked in this morning, I could smell somebody's breakfast that was in here. Okay. Sometimes it's a bad smell. Okay. Other axons of these olfactory tract are going to project to our limbic system in the hypothalamus. Once again, the hypothalamus allows for control of our autonomic nervous system, while the limbic system is our emotional brain, right? Okay. So in the case of our limbic system hypothalamus, they're going to allow for emotion and memory evoked responses to odors. Maybe it's a good response, like you smell like a cologne that turns you on sexually or reminds you of something, like, you know, some people like to smell rain when it's, you know, in the summertime when it's about to rain. You can smell that, and it might bring back memories of something from a long time ago. And so the sense of smell is not just, you know, a sensation, it's also something that triggers stuff deeply for us. Okay. Now, in order for any of that to happen, we have to first convert that signal through olfactory transduction. Okay, it's a super complicated process. Here's our olfactory receptor cell, the bipolar neuron that we've been talking about. Here at the tip of the dendrite are those little tiny hair-like structures called cilia. We zoom in at them, you can find along the plasma membrane is a complicated protein situation. I'll just say it that way. Okay. Well, first things first, we need the chemical that we're smelling, what we call the odorant, to bind to a receptor. The receptor that is shown right here in yellow or orange, whatever that color is. Okay. Which then activates what's called a G protein. Okay. Which then, and it's just like a domino effect. This protein activates an enzyme called adenylate cyclase, or adenylyl cyclase, same thing, which then triggers ATP to be converted into cyclic AMP, which then triggers a cation channel to open up. And if the cation channel opens up, things like sodium and calcium can come in. And this is a neuron. So if enough sodium or calcium comes in, we can hit threshold. And if that's the case, when we hit threshold, action potentials become propagated down the axon of this neuron. So that's how it's all going to work. Now, this is an example of, let me type it out here for you guys so you can understand what it is. This is an example of what we call a second messenger system. A very complicated domino effect, where you've got two messengers. The first messenger is the odorant binding here. The second messenger is all this stuff inside the cyclic AMP, specifically opening up the cation channel, and that leads to depolarization and an action potential. As far as the exam goes, are you going to need to know every single one of these steps? Are you going to need to know all of this stuff that was on the previous page? The answer to that is no, absolutely not. Okay. That's way, way, way too much complicated jazz. Okay. Stuff I might ask you on the exam, would be which sensation involves a second messenger system? Olfaction is that. Okay. This is a second messenger system. Okay. I might also ask you on, this is stuff I definitely will ask you questions on with these special senses, which cranial nerves are involved, which you already should know from your last test, which was literally today. Okay, so you're going to want to know that the right and left olfactory cranial nerves, number one, are involved with the sense of smell. Okay, whereas like vision, those are the cranial nerves. Number two, the optic nerves. With hearing and balance, it's the vestibulocochlear. And we're going to get into all that stuff later on, but we're out of time, and that's fine. We'll stop here because we just finished our first of the 5 sensations. We'll start with taste or gestation on Thursday. We should be in good shape to get through the rest of this lecture without too much trouble, and move on from there.